a meal together, we enjoyed some table talk around the tables, answering the question, what is one thing that you learned from your father? And we had so many great responses at so many different tables, and we're grateful for God's work that he's doing in fathers to be raised up, and in some cases to reproduce what their father taught them, and then in other cases to restore and bring healing as to the painful, difficult situations and circumstances in the homes of our fathers. And today we're grateful that we're together, and we're going to look at a home that was led by a father named Abram. Abram was a church leader, a patriarch of the Christian faith, and he had his own faith and was interacting with the Father in heaven who had given him a promise. Before we get too far into that, I want to tell you about Sarah Singlestress. Sarah Singlestress chose to marry a non-believer by faith. Sarah Singlestress met a coworker, and the coworker pursued her, and she knew that her coworker was not a person of faith, didn't trust in Jesus, and wasn't following Jesus. And to her friends and to her family and to her church family and to her pastors, it was a problem. To her, it was slightly a problem, but an opportunity. And her friends and family that she trusted were cautioning her. Her pastors were advising her against pursuing this. But she was known to say things like, God didn't give me this desire for marriage if he didn't intend to fulfill it. I'm going to win this particular man after we get married. I'm going to do that by faith, trusting that God will help me lead him and reach him, and eventually he'll come to saving faith. And instead of patiently waiting and trusting God's timing and God's purposes, she chooses her own path and marries him. And she assumed that she can help God if she had enough faith. She can convert him after they get married, and years after they got married. Sarah Singlestress was in a spiritually divided home. She was struggling through the resistance of her husband to the gospel and the difficulty in raising her children in faith, which had become a battleground as he sought to protect them and she sought to immerse them and to train them. And eventually her joy and her hope for what her family was going to become and look like turned to sorrow, and she realized what felt like faith at the time was a plan that had been birthed out of her own fear and had been birthed out of her own impatience. And now she is prayerfully trusting that God helps sort out the complicated family life that she now experiences. That story of Sarah Singlestress expresses the heart of what we're going to see in Genesis chapter 16. In Genesis chapter 16, you're going to see Sarai, who urges Abram to implement their own plan, have a child through my servant, Hagar. And it was her who implemented her own human workaround to God's promise that he had made to their family, to fulfill a divine promise that he himself was going to bring about this promised child. But Sarah and Abram, instead, they implement their own plan that led to family tension, family chaos, and also eventually led to generational strife. And the real strength isn't changing and charging ahead in blind faith. Real faith is waiting on God to implement his promises. And when everything we want isn't happening, everything God has promised isn't happening on our timeline, this is going to illustrate our tendency to control it and fix it, to fast forward God promises. And here's what we're going to see, that God doesn't need our hustle. He doesn't need our compromises. He doesn't need our workarounds. God needs our heart. Wait, trust, and watch. Do our part, let him do his part. And we're going to see this illustrated together. The starting point is foundational. The starting point of the story of Abraham is foundational. And here it is, that faith is the confidence that we hope for, what we hope for will actually happen. It gives us assurance about things we cannot see. It is a confident assurance that what God has promised is going to happen, really happen. A confident assurance. That's my part. God's part, he's going to bring to pass what he promised is going to happen. That's what I hope for. And while I'm hoping, I have confident assurance that he's at work, that our God-given hope is actually going to happen. So God makes this promise to Abram. Do you remember this? God makes this promise, and he says, Abram, I've selected you, and I am going to bring blessing. Eventually, we're going to bring Jesus, but I'm going to bring blessing to you, your descendants, and all the families of the world. And when he starts to, Abraham says, terrific, moves out of town. God leads him to a land he will show him. He goes by faith, and then he has doubts. Then he believes and says, I believe, and we see that God says that I'm counting your belief as your faith as righteousness. And then he says, but how can I be sure? And he needs reassurance again, and God gives him reassurance. And now, here we are, years and years later, we're waiting for this promise that God has made to Abram. And he has already doubted and believed and questioned and heard God's reassurance, but now it's taking so long. It's taking too long. So here in Genesis 16, we see Abram and Sarah make a decision to help God move along a little quicker. Let's go. I trust what you said is going to happen, but we kind of like, I don't know if you've noticed this, God, but we're not getting younger. We're getting older. We don't see anything happening that matches your promise. And they learn a lesson. And they learn a lesson that is something that future generations can also learn in the way that this goes. And they learn a lesson about the importance of trusting in God's perfect timing and God's perfect promise. So, our lesson starts. What we learn from them starts today here. It starts in changing God's plans. When we see them start to do make the questionable decision to go about changing God's plans. They impatiently execute their own plan to rush God into his own promise. Let me say that again. They impatiently begin to rush God into implementing God's own promise. That's what they do, and that's what they did. Check this out. Now, Sarai, Abram's wife, had not been able to bear children for him. But she did have an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, the Lord has prevented me from having children. I don't know if she remembers, but the Lord had promised that she would have a child. But here's how she sees it. The Lord's prevented this. I'm barren. He did not allow us to have children, even though he promised that I would. The Lord has prevented me from having children. Go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her. So, Christian dads who are here today, listening today, tuned in today, this is where Abram, a man chosen by God to live with confident assurance that God will make his promise happen, says, no. We are not doing that. That's not God's promise. That's our plans. God has made us a promise, and this is not God's promise. This clearly is not his plan. We are now implementing our own plan to accomplish God's promise. No, we're not doing it. That's our own impatient plan, not his promise. Is that what Abram says? You know the story? You guess the story. If you don't know the story, you can anticipate the story. Is that what Abram says? And Abram agreed with Sarai's proposal. It's a great idea, honey. Why don't you make those arrangements? You know where to find me. So Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian servant, and gave her to Abram as a wife. So Abram had sexual relations with Hagar, and she became pregnant. But when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to treat her mistress, Sarai, with contempt. Then Sarai said to Abram, "This is all your fault." No comment. "I put my servant into your arms. But now that she's pregnant, she treats me with contempt." Little family drama here. It's going to get bad. It's going to get bad. Abram replied, "Look, she's your servant, so deal with her as you see fit." Then Sarai treated Hagar so harshly that she finally ran away. I expect we will one day soon see a reality series based on this family. And it will be a hit. So there's a problem here. There's a problem here. It's not just a communication problem. It's not just a family problem. It's not just a marriage problem. It's not just a whatever, employee love triangle problem. What we have here is Sarai's action with Hagar represents trying to achieve God's blessing through impatient human effort. Trying to achieve God's blessing through impatient human effort and control, rather than patiently waiting on God to bring about his promise to their family. They chase down a counterfeit plan. Instead of God's timing and miraculous power, they implement a plan that sabotages, undermines, and brings chaos into their own family, into their own home. Her human effort to shortcut God's promises deeply complicated the family dynamic. Deeply. Families are hard enough without implementing an impatient counterfeit plan. And now this family, instead of a family of promise and blessing and flourishing, now they're dealing with immorality, abuse, bitterness, contempt, blame, revenge, and we're going to see abandonment here because of shortcuts to do things our way instead of patiently accepting and receiving that we're going to do things God's way. Faith requires waiting and trusting. You know how at the beginning of the story, Abram's faith needed him to kind of move forward and step out into God's unknown plan? Here's an example of how our faith is not bold risk-taking. Here's an example of how our faith is waiting back until God brings about what he's promised he can bring about miraculously, purposefully, by his own wisdom and in his own timing, even when it's difficult. This means the kind of faith that isn't doing nothing. It means actively seeking God's plan and aligning our lives, our actions, our decisions with what he's promised. In the moments of weakness, this is true, I think, for a lot of us. I mean, I don't know how you read the Old Testament, but I tend to read the Old Testament the way I read the rest of the Bible, which is I look at these characters and I say things like this to myself: what a fool. What a dummy. God, I see why you put these dum-dums in the Bible. So we can look at these dum-dums and say, they don't know what they're doing. Thank God for me and my life. But instead, here's a better way to read it. This Bible that we're reading and this story isn't about us, but it's for us. And we can see patterns of who God is and who he's revealed himself to be and what he expects of us and how he relates to us and we relate to him. And there's moments of weakness where you and I adopt our own alternative shortcut plans that are rooted not in faith, they're rooted in fear. Sarah, simple stress. Stressed out about her future flourishing in her marriage and family and growing a family and doing her own thing, her own way, out of line with God's plan and promise for her. Our human efforts to assist in fulfilling God's divine promises, here's what it does almost every time: it complicates our life. It brings chaos into our lives. And when we take a shortcut with God's promises, we find ourselves identifying with other people who have unknowingly taken the reins of their own life and have driven themselves into unneeded, unnecessary confusion, complication, and chaos. There's another family that I wanted to mention to you, the Fearfultons. The Fearfultons, they're from Syracuse here, and they're a sincere Christian couple, and they're raising a family, and their oldest son, this is Abe and Sarah Fearfulton. They are raising kids, and their son goes away to college, and while their son was in college, they had an experience together where they had to take fearful control of their family, and they did so. Their son comes home from college and says, I have something to tell you. I was at a meeting among in chapel, and the speaker was a missionary, and as the speaker spoke of what God had led that missionary to do, I had a burning passion in my heart. I know what God wants me to do with my life. I know where I'm going. I know what my next step is. And Mom and Dad, I want you to prayerfully think through this vivid call that I sense to the mission field. It's all I can think about is lost people on the mission field. Mom and Dad say, slow down. Whoa, wait a second. You're still young, and what you're saying is very risky. What you're saying is very unstable. And I don't know if you've thought this through, but you're signing up to be broke and to be dependent on other people for your livelihood and your income. And also, by the way, this is a great plan B if God were to help it happen, but you need a strong plan A. And they said, here's what we're going to do. We think that your experience in college here is kind of growing this fantastical fantasy. It's time. It's time to invest you to get a plan A together. They send their son to Cornell. They convince him to major in biochemistry. Eventually, it leads to terrible grades. He's suffering with terrible sadness, stress, and anxiety. And in depression, he drops out of Cornell. Parents are trying to figure out, what are we going to do? What are we going to do with him? Meanwhile, Dad ends up at a men's retreat, and God works deeply to convict him, saying something like this: these are my plans for your son. They are my plans, not his plans. And Dad was overcome with conviction. Dad runs as fast as he can to get himself back home and gets the family together and reaches out to his son and repents to his own son and family. And he says, God's plans for you, I heard this loud and clear, are better for you than my plans for you. They're better. And the son, as you can imagine, goes on in the very challenging, difficult, hard to see, hard to understand, hard to walk in a straight line, goes on to thrive as a generationally renowned missionary in Thailand. How does he do it? Why is he thriving? Why is he flourishing? Because God's promise was his plan. And in spite of all of the complications created by the family, God saw that plan through and had to overcome and override and implement Dad's plan based on fear and control, to be a success in the culture rather than be invested. The son now tells a story. The son now tells a story of battling depression, saying to his family and friends, I can only see myself in my future serving and reaching lost people that are suffering around the world. And the son goes on to thrive as a missionary. So we have dads here among us. We have dads who are listening. And Christian parents, we all can learn this lesson, that even godly parents can accidentally block or get in the way or create unnecessary potholes and obstacles to God's plan for our children. And why would we do that? Out of fear, out of control, out of pride, and even our mistakes. Even though that's true, our mistakes can become a part of our child's redemption story. Some of you are living that redemption story. You have overcome some of those mistakes yourself, and you've done so by God's intervention and his own special work that he's done in you and in your life. So you've got plans and promises that God has made to you. If you belong to Jesus and your family belongs to Jesus and your kids are being raised in the faith, God has made promises to them and to you to heal your inner heartache. God has made a promise to you for freedom that you can experience from guilt and shame and death. And God has made a promise to you that by his Holy Spirit, he is present with you. He has promised hope for life change when you belong to Jesus. God has promised flourishing in your marriage or flourishing in your singleness. That's a promise that God has put before you in your life. God's promised you meaning in your work. Can you imagine the work that you're doing? God says has meaning. Every single hour you're clocking in and doing the work you're doing, it has meaning. God has promised that to you. God has promised provision for your needs. God has promised wisdom for your trouble and resolution to your conflict. God has promised you comfort in your suffering and the ability to forgive and be set free once and for all and go about thriving in your life. God has promised you restoration. Restoration to all that you've lost and thought was gone forever. God's promised you, I'm a God of restoration. God has promised you revenge and justice for all evildoers. So God's promised you, you can calm down. You can calm down. He's going to take care of all vengeance and all justice, and eventually he's going to, all the wicked and evildoers receive his own justice. And God, ultimately, has promised each of us eternal life, life everlasting through faith in Jesus, our priceless inheritance. That's a promise. So, we receive that by faith. We walk in that and live in that and learn to grow in that. Or we say, I'm doing things my own way. None of these things are happening fast enough. I am going to see to it that I'm successful, even if I'm not blessed by God. I'll be successful. And that's the challenge. That's the tension. And that's the same tension that you're seeing show up here in the life of Abram and Sarai. So here's what we do now. Wait. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is wait on God. Have you discovered that? Sometimes waiting is harder than doing. If God just told me something I am going to do, I'll get to doing it. It's not the doing that's hard, it's the waiting that's hardest. Wait on God. When you're tired of waiting, when you're tempted to grab control and you're tempted to make your own plans, or you're tempted to blame someone or blame God, or to create and generate and carve out your own shortcuts, that's when faith becomes real. Not when things are easy, but when you trust God's promises are better than your plans. When you say, I can make a plan here, I'm not sure it's God's promise, so I'm going to trust that his promise is the direction that my life needs to take. Faith doesn't mean sitting back. It doesn't mean doing nothing. Faith means not doing something that God hasn't asked for us to do. And we see that in this family, that's happening here in this family. Sarah, her story reminds us, waiting isn't wasting. Obedience is more important than opportunity. God's timing tests whether we trust his character more than our own judgment. God's not silent. He's not sitting by idly watching Abram and Sarah sabotage their own life. Instead, what's next in the healing of this family, what's next in the healing of this family of promise is this: hearing God's voice. Now we're at this stage. Now we're at the hearing God's voice stage. They've already changed God's plans, but now it's time, and we're going to see how it happens, that they get to hear God's voice as he redirects them and redirects their path and their life. So the angel of the Lord, last we knew what happened. Hagar ran away. The angel of the Lord found Hagar beside a spring of water in the wilderness and along the road to Shur. The angel said to her, Hagar, Sarai's servant, where have you come from and where are you going? And she said to the angel, I am running away from my mistress Sarai. So Hagar's now alone after abandoning the family, run away from her harsh treatment, from her beloved family, right? Her livelihood. Again, she's another person that's off on her own, doing her thing here. And while she was running, here's what I want you to notice. While she was running, God pursued her. God pursued her. I'm intrigued that Hagar doesn't finally get to a particular part here and then say in this road, this is so hard. What have I done? I've really messed up. Now there's no chance of really me thriving. I'm living off of my own. Where am I going next? Instead, she is found in her own wilderness by herself, and the angel of God in heaven pursues her and finds her. And then asks her these silly questions that God always asks that he already knows the answer to. Where are you going? What are you doing? What's up with you? What's going on? The angel asks her these questions after finding her on a road in a wilderness. And you can do the imagery yourself. A young slave servant alone in the wilderness. What's ahead for her? Despair first, then death. Or perhaps being picked up and become a slave of another tribe, another people group. And the angel says, what's your story? Hagar says, I'm running away. I've got a harsh boss. She treated me terribly. And things turned sour after I followed her demands of me. I did what she asked me to do, and then things got all kinds of sour in this family. And I've suffered hurtful consequences. And I wonder if Hagar even mentioned, I suffered these terrible consequences in a family after someone else's disobedience, not mine. After someone else did what they wanted and ignored God's promise and made selfish decisions on their own. These are not my decisions, it was someone else's decisions. Look what God says to Hagar, the outsider servant. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her authority. Sometimes, God's way is the hard way. Sometimes God doesn't change the plan because the plan's gotten harsh and difficult. Now, in our thinking, we know what the angel should have said. All right, stand down and stand by right here, because this woman and this doofus that somehow the Father in heaven had made some promise to has really, really got this twisted up. But I want you to hold on here, because I'm going to go straighten this out for you. And I'm going to make sure that we smooth this family out, and then we're going to get you back there, because the Father in heaven's got some plans that he's trying to accomplish, right? It's not what he says. He says, your boss is harsh and mistreating you. I want you to go back there. Here's why. Because my promise is going to happen. And my plans for you and this family are very difficult, but they're better. My plans are very difficult, but they're better. My plans for you are very difficult, but they're better, because they're my plans, and I'm in them. And I cannot leave you here stranded in the wilderness, because Sarah's plan and Abraham's plan, whatever they cooked up that have put you in this position, is going to damage you way more than getting back to this family and doing it my way. This is going to be lifelong damage that cannot be restored and healed. But I'm going to bring you back to this family that's full of complications and chaos, and I'm going to see my promise through. And it's going to be difficult as you submit to your harsh boss. Now, some of you are literalists, and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm not quitting that job after all. My terrible boss. God is speaking to me about staying in my job. This is not an anecdote or plans for what we should do at work, right? This is not. Instead, this is the idea that sometimes when we do our own thing, we experience hardship, and really God is allowing hardship to accomplish his great plan. So, don't want to take too much time with this. Return to your mistress, submit to her authority. And God said, you're going to do it my way. Stop running and return to that hardship. And he challenges her towards humble surrender. He commands her to do the hard thing. And look at this grace plan for her restoration. By the way, this is the rest of what the angel says. Then the angel added, I will give you more descendants than you can count. And the angel also said, "You are now pregnant and will give birth to a son, and you are to name him Ishmael," which means God hears, "for the Lord has heard your cry of distress." It's okay if some of you see yourself in the life of Hagar. Someone else has really botched things up. They have selfishly disobeyed God and done things their own way, and their life has been, their mistakes and the consequences of their choices have been hurled into your life. And it's hard to accept. And it's important for us to hear God saying to Hagar, while you were running away from your mess in fear and frustration, I was at work restoring what you've lost. God says, even though you've been blindsided with the sinful disobedience of people that I'm using, people that you trusted in your own home, I hear your cry of distress. The hard path that you're on today, church family, it's important for you to see that in that hard path, God is at work bringing both blessing and consequence. Blessing and consequence. How might you know that you're in God's path of blessing and consequence? Here's how. You can genuinely say, it's been very difficult. This path I've been on has been very difficult, but I see God at work. My marriage didn't go the way I expected it. My family didn't go the way I expected it. Owning a home and owning a business didn't go the way I expected it. I don't know how I got here, but it's bumpy and it's hard and it's challenging. But when I look back, I can see how God is still at work, restoring things, working to heal things. That's how God works. Look how Hagar responds to this restoration. Hagar's response to God's pursuit. Thereafter, Hagar used another name to refer to the Lord who had spoken to her. She said, "You are the God who sees me." You are the God who sees me. She also said, "Have I truly seen the one who sees me? Is he seeing me, and am I now really seeing her?" Why is she surprised that God sees her? I'll give you one indication as to why she's surprised. She's just a forgotten slave. In her own home, in her own tribe, and among her own household, she's a forgotten slave. She's an outsider to this promise. She's not an insider to this promise. Abram and Sarai are elevated with rank. She instead is marginalized and submitted into a slavery role, and she's trying to grasp, but God sees me? Even though this promise is to them, the insiders, God sees me, the outsiders? She left God's family willfully. She abandoned the family of promise. They didn't leave her, and it's hard to accept that God's grace is deep enough for outsider slaves too. If the consequences of someone else's disobedience has landed in your life like a bomb, and now you're stuck living with chaos, and you're stuck living in the complications of their decisions, this hard path that you've been walking, this is one thing we know about God. He has not left you alone. He sees you in your wilderness. And you can know him as the God who sees me. You can know him as the God, as the unbelievable experience of seeing and knowing the God who sees and knows you, even though you don't deserve it, even though you might feel like an outsider, even though you don't have any rank and you don't know of any vivid promises that God gave you to change the world through your descendants. Just because you feel alone in the wilderness, just because you feel trapped by someone else's disobedience in your own life, it doesn't mean you're alone, and it doesn't ever mean that God doesn't see you. Our God, your God, is the one and only God who can see you. He's the one and only God who does see you exactly where you've landed. So here's God's voice speaking to those of us who are outsiders with no rank and no real vivid historical promise. You're not alone. I see you. It reminds me of when Jesus is trying to teach his disciples, do you not understand how much the Father in heaven sees you and knows your name and is providing for you everything you need? Think of this. There isn't a sparrow that falls to the ground that the Father in heaven doesn't know exactly where that sparrow landed. How much more will the Father in heaven be providing everything you need and caring for your needs? His provision, His promise. Your road may be difficult, but if you're careful to look, you can see and you can trust that somewhere along the way, God's at work. What is He doing? He's at work to restore what you've lost. He is a restoration God. There's still a lingering problem. The lingering problem is that there's consequences to disobedience, right? Consequences. Because there's consequences to our sinful disobedience doesn't mean there isn't love, but there's still consequences. And these consequences are going to hurt everyone in some way. Now we'll see this family facing God's consequences. Really quick, check this out. This son of yours will be a wild man. This is Ishmael. So, you're going to have more descendants than you can count. That's the good news. That's the blessing, God says. That's the restoration. Come on back to the family. I'm going to bring restoration to you. Here's the consequences. Here's the pain of disobedience. Here's the pain of their disobedience. He's going to be a wild man, as untamed as a wild donkey, and he will raise his fist against everyone, and everyone will be against him. Yes, he will live in open hostility to all his relatives. The consequences aren't all negative. Both blessing and cursing. What's the blessing? God redeemed her pain with something beautiful, a son. What's the consequences? Also, not just a son, but more descendants than she can remember. What are the consequences? It's a bit of a curse. Her son is going to live in open hostility to all of his relatives with a raised fist, generation after generation after generation. Many commentators believe that this explains the ongoing generational, centuries-old conflict between the Arabs and the Jews. Ishmael representing the Arab lineage, and the Jews, of course, representing the promised son that had come through Isaac, who had come through God's promise to Abram and Sarah. Sometimes God brings both joy and consequences to our family's disobedience. Sometimes even more. I want to mention that something even more is happening here, and this is where I'm going to hand something off to you. Here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I'm going to ask you to do, along with your reading plan that I'm so confident that you're all caught up on. Here's what I want to give you a verse. And if you write things down or you take pictures or you go back in the app here, I want to show you something that's worth checking out. Oh, actually, you can write this down. Galatians 4, verses 23 to 26. You're not going to believe what you find there. I might not tell you. No, I'm going to mention it. Do you know what's in Galatians 4, 23 to 26? Paul says, of course you know what Hagar and Sarah, you know what that's all about, right? Can you believe that? The Apostle Paul in Galatians says, you remember in Genesis chapter 16 with that big thing, the big fallout between Sarah and Hagar? Here's what he says. This was an illustration. This is an illustration between Hagar, representing the law that had been given, and Abram and Sarah trying to do it on their own way to bring about God's promise in their own effort, by their own performance, by following the rules, and it was a disaster. And I want to compare that covenant to the new covenant, Jesus, now to where we put our faith in Jesus, and instead of all that performing and all of that effort and doing things our way, we instead receive the promise to treasure and trust Jesus. And all the perfections that Jesus is. An eternal inheritance, His is ours. We share in Him as we're joined in Him. How? By faith. God's promise is received by faith, not by making our own plans and our own effort and our own performance and doing our own thing. That's how Paul explains to the church at Galatia what this story means. We do it our own way, our own effort, suffer. Receive God's promise by faith, wait for him to do the work, and we thrive and we grow. And that's the contrast that he gives us. So Hagar gave Abram a son, and Abram named him Ishmael, and Abram was 86 years old when Ishmael was born. So if you're a literalist, some of you men, you don't have a child yet, hold on. Hold on. You never know. Really quick, here's what I want to ask you to do. Let God's timing shape God's promises into God's results. Let God's timing shape God's promises into God's results. Wait, trust, obey, rest. But we often don't trust God's plan when it comes to waiting. And when we move ahead without him, unknowingly, you create an Ishmael. Sure, there's going to be some blessings along the way. God is a restoration God, and he works even though we've made bad choices in our life. But in our Ishmael, something that may live, but it isn't blessed by God. His design for our life is not found in that result. And this passage is a warning to all of those who try to accomplish God's promises through human shortcuts. All of the ways that as a dad I can do this. I can make significant family sacrifices of my time and make significant family sacrifices of our money to ensure that my kids are successful, but make almost no sacrifices to make sure my kids are a disciple, that they know Jesus and are following Jesus. And I think of all this, how it applies to our church family too. And the temptation for church leaders to go and do all the things that bring successful church growth. And meanwhile, bring in teachers who teach false gospels, but they're popular. They get a lot of clicks and a lot of attendance. To steal and adopt other churches' DNA and mission and identity and say, well, now theirs is ours because theirs is successful, and so now we're a hollowed out mimic of someone else and something else. And those types of temptations are very real for church leaders. And though the church may grow in its number, it grows shallow. Discipleship is generic. Knowledge of God, shallow. The culture of the church becomes consumer-driven. But we're growing. My plans, not God's. Pastor and servant leaders experience burnout. Why? Because keeping the hype going is such a emptying, withering job instead of just flowing with what God is doing and where he's at work. It's a temptation for every one of us to do our own thing and implement our own plan and abandon God's promise. Our church is God's church. He knows how to grow his church healthy. My role and our church leader's role is to see where we contribute, but stay out of his way. And don't hijack his promises to come up with plans that work somewhere else. To have a trendy, hot, popular church for a phase. I pray that these words, this story, the knowledge of God and how he works comes alive in your heart. I pray that it takes root and bears fruit, and that he gives you the wisdom on where to course correct, where to inspect and investigate and prayerfully ask God, where am I headed down my path for my plans instead of waiting on your promise? Where is that happening? Show me, and I am going to look to see where you're at work. Let's pray together. Father, my heart goes out to our church family, our listeners and learners together here. Dads who feel